The storm had clawed its way up the channel with little warning, turning the September afternoon to a false twilight. Rain drove sideways across the headland, and the sea below churned against the rocks in a ceaseless, grinding roar. Inside the small stone cottage that crouched at the cliff's edge, Miss Helena Wren pulled her woolen shawl tighter and peered through the rain-streaked window toward the coast road. She had been watching that road since noon, ever since old Mr. Trevithick had come limping up the path with news that the lower stretch had begun to crumble. A whole section of the embankment, he said, had slewed away into the ravine, leaving a carriage-wide void hidden just beyond the blind curve. The warning post had not yet been erected. Anyone approaching from the east at speed would have no chance. Helena knew that road as she knew the veins on her own hands. Her father, the late vicar of Porthellow, had walked it every Sunday for 30 years. She had walked it herself 100 times to deliver medicines and letters to the outlying farms. Now, with the rains softening the ground by the hour, the collapse would only grow worse. The next carriage through might be the last. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. Nothing moved on the road. Then, faintly above the percussion of the waves, she heard it, the distant, rhythmic thunder of galloping horses. Helena snatched her cloak from the peg and flung open the door before reason could dissuade her. The wind caught the hood at once, whipping her dark hair across her face. She lifted her skirts and ran. The road bent sharply around the shoulder of the cliff, hidden by a tangle of gorse and wind-stunted hawthorn. The sound of hooves grew louder, punctuated now by the jangle of harness and the low, urgent shouts of a driver. She could see the yellow glow of carriage lamps swaying through the gray curtain of rain. They were coming too fast. They could not see the danger. Helena stumbled onto the road just before the curve, her boots slipping in the mud. She raised both arms high, her cloak billowing like a signal flag. "Stop, in the name of mercy, stop." The lead horse screamed, a high, terrified sound, as the driver hauled on the reins. The carriage, a black, mud-spattered vehicle of elegant make, skidded sideways, its wheels cutting deep furrows in the softened earth. For one sickening moment Helena thought it would overturn. Then it juddered to a halt, steam rising from the horse's flanks, a bare 20 yards from where she stood. A man's voice, low and commanding, cut through the storm. "What the devil is the meaning of this?" The carriage door swung open. A figure descended without waiting for the step to be lowered, a tall man in a many-caped greatcoat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Even in the dim light, Helena registered the breadth of his shoulders, the calm authority in the way he moved. He was not a man accustomed to being halted on the road by bedraggled women. She drew a ragged breath. The road ahead is gone. The cliff has given way. Another 60 paces and your carriage would have plunged into the ravine. The driver, a sturdy man with a face the color of old oak, had already scrambled down and was peering ahead. He returned a moment later, his expression grave. "She speaks true, sir. The whole verge is sheared away. A dozen feet or more, straight down into the water, we would have gone over blind." The tall man removed his hat, and Helena saw his face for the first time. Rain-plastered dark hair to a high forehead. His eyes, a deep and penetrating gray, studied her with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of her sodden gown, her tangled hair, the mud caking her hem. There was something in his gaze that was not merely gratitude. It was sharp, assessing, as if he were cataloging every detail of her appearance and finding it wholly unexpected. "You came out in this tempest to stop us," he said. "It was not a question." "I could hardly stay by my fire and watch you die," she replied, a tart edge creeping into her voice. She was cold, wet, and her heart was still hammering against her ribs. One corner of his mouth lifted. "No, I do not imagine you could." He took a step toward her, and the rain between them seemed to thin. "What is your name?" She hesitated, propriety warred with a strange, fluttering awareness. "Miss Helena Wren. My father was the vicar here." "Was," the single word was gentle. "He died last winter. I live now with my aunt in the cottage upon the rise." The man inclined his head. "You have my deepest thanks, Miss Wren, and my word that this service will not be forgotten." He reached into his coat and withdrew a flat silver case. From it he produced a card, but when he extended his hand, the wind caught it and dashed it into the mud. He made a soft sound of frustration, then simply held her gaze. "I am traveling under circumstances that require a measure of discretion. You will forgive me if I do not announce myself fully. But I will find you again." Before she could respond, he turned to the driver. "We will walk the horses back to the crossroads. There was an inn at the last village." "The wee chief, sir." "Then we put up there tonight." He turned back to Helena, and the gray eyes held her with something that felt almost like a promise. "Good night, Miss Wren. Walk carefully back to your cottage. You have done a remarkable thing this evening." Helena stood motionless in the rain as the carriage was carefully turned and led away into the murk. The last she saw of the man was the pale flash of his collar as he glanced back at her over his shoulder. She pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart beat a swift, inexplicable rhythm, and she knew with a certainty that unsettled her deeply. Everything had just changed. The Wheatsheaf Inn was a low-beamed, whitewashed establishment that had stood in the village of Porthellow for 2 centuries, and it had never hosted a guest who stirred as much whispered speculation as the tall stranger who arrived in the storm. By morning, the entire village knew that a gentleman of evident wealth had been turned back from the cliff road, that he had taken the best rooms, and that he had asked, in the most casual manner, about the young woman who had saved his party. Helena learned of his continued presence when she walked down to the baker for the day's bread. Mrs. Polwell, a woman whose talent for gathering news exceeded her skill with a rolling pin, leaned across the counter and fixed Helena with a bright, inquisitive eye. "That gentleman you stopped on the road, he's still at the inn. Calls himself Mr. Alexander Ashe. A London man by his accent, though not the flashy sort. Proper quality if you ask me. And he was asking after you, Miss Wren, most particular." Helena felt a prickle of warmth climb her throat. He was merely grateful, Mrs. Polwell. Anyone would have done the same. "Anyone did not," the baker's wife said pointedly, "and gratitude does not usually extend to booking rooms for a week." A week. Helena carried the information back to the cottage along with the bread, turning it over in her mind. Her aunt, a gentle, fatting woman who had grown vague since her brother's death, noticed nothing, but Helena found herself restless all morning. She took up her mending, set it down, walked to the window, and told herself she was watching the weather. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and glittering. The damaged road would need surveying. The parish would need to send word to the landowner, whoever that might be. The Wren family had once known the great names of the county, but that was before her father's illness had swallowed their modest savings, before her brother had vanished into the army and sent no word in 3 years. At 2 o'clock, a knock sounded at the cottage door. Helena smoothed her dove-gray dress, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and opened the door. Alexander Ashe stood on the threshold, dressed now in a coat of dark blue superfine that fit his broad shoulders to perfection. Without the rain and the shadow of danger, he was even more imposing, his features strong, clean-shaven, his manner carrying the easy assurance of a man who moved through the world without apology. "Miss Wren," he said and bowed, "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I wish to thank you properly and to ask if you would accompany me to view the damage. I am told you know this stretch of road better than anyone living." She should have refused. She should have cited propriety, her aunt's health, the dozen small duties that filled her day. Instead, she heard herself say, "Give me a moment to fetch my bonnet." They walked the cliff path together, the sun warm on their shoulders, the sea a restless sheet of hammered silver far below. He asked intelligent questions about the soil, the drainage, the history of the road. She answered with a knowledge that clearly surprised him, speaking of geological strata and the erosion patterns she had observed since childhood. "You have an uncommon education," he observed. "My father believed that a mind was a gift to be cultivated, regardless of one's sex." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. He was, I think, ahead of his time. It did not make him popular with some of the parish. And your brother, he is not here to assist you and your aunt. The question caught her unprepared. She looked away, toward the distant smudge of a ship on the horizon. My brother is with the regiment in India. We have not heard from him in some time. Mr. Ashe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, I understand what it is to carry a family's weight alone. There was something in the timbre of his voice, a depth of private sorrow, that made her look up sharply. Their eyes met, and for a suspended moment neither spoke. Helena felt the ground beneath her feet, the steady pull of the wind, and a new and terrifying awareness that this man was becoming far more than a stranger on a rain-swept road. When they parted at her gate an hour later, he took her hand. His grip was warm, firm, and entirely too brief. I shall remain in Porthellow for several days, he said. The road must be made safe. I intend to see that it is. You are very generous, Mr. Ashe, but the road is not your responsibility. A curious expression flickered in his eyes, something almost like guilt, quickly masked. Let us say that I have developed a personal interest in ensuring that no more travelers meet with disaster here. He released her hand and strode away down the lane. Helena watched him go, and in the quiet of her mind, a small, insistent voice whispered that Mr. Alexander Ashe was not telling her the truth. Not all of it, and the question of what he was hiding would not let her sleep that night. The repairs began within 2 days. A crew of laborers arrived from a town 20 miles distant, along with a lean, efficient surveyor who spoke in clipped sentences and deferred to Mr. Ashe with a deference that bordered on the military. Timber was brought in to shore up the embankment. A new drainage channel was dug. The speed and scale of the operation astonished the village, and speculation about the mysterious gentleman's identity swelled to a fever pitch. Helena watched the work from the headland, a new and unwelcome emotion stirring in her chest. She had grown accustomed to her quiet, half-invisible existence, the dutiful niece, the impoverished clergyman's daughter, a figure of pity and vague respect. But Alexander Ashe had looked at her as though she were neither invisible nor pitiable. He had sought out her company 3 times since their walk to the cliff, finding excuses that were transparent and yet charming. A book he thought she might enjoy, sent from the inn with a note. An invitation to join him for a stroll through the village gardens. A question about the local wildflowers that she knew, even as she answered it, was merely a pretext. That afternoon, a formal invitation arrived at the cottage. Squire Trevanion, the county's most prominent landowner, was hosting a supper and dance at his manor house to mark the safe repair of the cliff road, though in truth, Helena suspected, he was eager to attach himself to the wealthy stranger in their midst. The invitation included Miss Wren and her aunt. Aunt Cordelia, animated for the first time in months, insisted they attend. It will do you good to be seen, my dear. You have worn black long enough. Helena's gown was 3 years out of fashion, a simple silk in a shade of dusky rose that had been her mother's. She altered it with careful stitches, added a ribbon of deeper rose at the waist, and hoped she would not look entirely the poor relation. The Trevanion ballroom was ablaze with candles when they arrived. The squire, florid and beaming, made a great show of welcoming Mr. Ashe, who stood near the hearth in a coat of midnight blue, his cravat tied with an understated elegance that put every other gentleman in the room to shame. When he saw Helena, his expression changed, a softening, a focusing, that made the breath catch in her throat. He crossed the room to her side, ignoring the curious stares, and bowed. "Miss Wren, you look very well this evening." "You are kind to say so, sir." Her gloved hand trembled faintly as she placed it in his. "I am not kind," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "I am merely honest." The dancing began. He claimed her hand for the first set, and as they moved through the figures of the quadrille, Helena was acutely aware of his nearness, the clean scent of sandalwood and linen, the way his gray eyes never left her face. They spoke little, but the silence between them was charged and alive. It was during a pause in the music that a name sliced through the hum of conversation like a blade. They say the Duke of Ashworth is finally returning to his estates this month. He has been abroad for 2 years, I hear, ever since the old Duke died. Helena felt the man beside her stiffen. His hand, resting lightly at her waist, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Is your grace expected locally?" someone asked the heir. Alexander Ash's face was perfectly composed, but Helena, standing close enough to feel the sudden tension in his frame, saw a muscle flex along his jaw. He did not answer. A moment later, the squire's eldest daughter, a handsome, golden-haired young woman named Miss Lydia Trevanion, inserted herself gracefully between them. "Mr. Ash," she said, flashing him a brilliant smile, "you have neglected me shockingly this evening. I shall insist upon the next dance, and you must tell me everything about London." Helena stepped back, a chill settling over her despite the warmth of the room. She watched as Alexander Ash, a name that now seemed impossibly flimsy, bowed to Miss Trevanion and led her onto the floor. His smile was polite, distant, but when his eyes flicked back toward Helena for just a moment, she saw something that looked terribly like an apology. She did not dance again. She pleaded a headache, found a quiet alcove near the terrace doors, and tried to still the rising storm in her heart. The Duke of Ashworth. She knew that name. Everyone in the county knew it. The Ashworth estates encompassed half the coastline, including the very road that had collapsed. He was one of the wealthiest peers in the South, and rumor had it that his late father had entangled the inheritance in a web of debts and obligations that could only be untangled by a strategic marriage. A marriage, the gossip said, to Lady Marguerite Selby, the daughter of a London banking family whose fortune would save the dukedom. Helena pressed a hand to her midriff. She felt foolish. She felt betrayed, but she had no claim to him, no understanding, no promise. He had merely been kind, and yet the kindness had felt like something more. She turned toward the terrace, desperate for air. Through the half-open door, she heard two voices in low conference, a man's deep tones and the briefer responses of a servant. "The surveyor reports that the lower caves are intact, Your Grace. The collapse opened a new entrance. The mineral seam appears extensive." "We shall discuss it later," the Duke's voice unmistakable now. "I must return to the ballroom before I am missed, and send word to London. Lady Marguerite will expect me within the fortnight. The engagement cannot be postponed further." Helena stood frozen, her hand pressed to her lips. The words echoed in her skull, cold and final. The engagement. She had not imagined it. She had not misunderstood. The man she had begun to lose her heart to was not only a duke, he was a duke promised to another woman. And everything between them, every glance and every carefully chosen word, had been built upon a foundation of silence and deception. She slipped back into the ballroom, her face composed into a mask of calm, and did not look at him again for the remainder of the evening. The morning sun cast long, slanted shadows across the cottage garden as Helena knelt among the lavender, her fingers working the dry earth without conscious thought. Sleep had been impossible. The events of the ball replayed in her mind in an endless, punishing loop, and with each repetition the same sharp edge of humiliation cut fresh. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him, the rhythm steady and unhurried. When she rose and turned, the Duke of Ashworth, she could no longer think of him as Alexander Ash, stood at her gate, hat in hand, his expression schooled to a careful neutrality that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Wren, might I speak with you?" "You seem to be doing so already, Your Grace." Her voice was flat, a weapon honed on a sleepless night. He flinched, the mighty Duke of Ashworth flinched. "You heard." "What?" "I heard enough." She brushed the soil from her hands, meeting his gaze without the deference he was surely accustomed to. "You are the Duke. You are betrothed. You allowed me to believe you were a private gentleman with an interest in road repair, and you allowed me to—" She stopped, her throat closing on the words she would not speak. "To care for me," he finished quietly, "as I have begun to care for you. Do not think I am unaware of what I have done, Helena." The use of her Christian name, spoken in that low, resonant voice, was almost her undoing. She steeled herself against it. "You have done nothing, your grace, except remind me of my place. A clergyman's daughter, living on the charity of her neighbors. You offered a pleasant diversion from the burdens of your rank. I shall know better next time. That is not what you are." He stepped forward, and the space between them shrank to something dangerous. "My title was a cage I did not ask for. My father's will has bound me to a marriage I have dreaded for 2 years. I travel under a false name because the weight of being Ashworth makes every human exchange into a negotiation. I came to Porthellow to inspect the coastal holdings in private." And then a woman with mud on her hem and a storm in her hair stood in the road and saved my life without knowing I had a fortune to offer her. Do you understand what a gift that was? Helena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her ground. "A gift you repaid with lies." "With silence, which is not the same, though the injury may feel equal." He drew a breath. "The engagement to Lady Marguerite Selby was arranged by my father before his death. It is a financial necessity, not a choice. Break it, and the entail provisions allow my father's trustees to strip the unentailed lands upon which 300 tenant families depend. I have spent 2 years searching for another way." "And have you found one?" she asked, the question sharper than she intended. He was silent for a beat. "Perhaps. The collapse on the cliff road revealed a cavern. The surveyor I sent down has found a seam of fine tin, potentially one of the richest deposits in Cornwall. If it proves out, the income could free me from the Selby arrangement. But it will take months to develop, and the engagement is to be announced formally in London within the month." Helena wrapped her arms around herself, a chill creeping through her despite the morning's warmth. "Then you will go to London and you will do your duty, and I shall remain here and do mine. There is nothing more to be said." "There is everything more." He reached for her hand, and before she could pull away, he pressed something into her palm, a small, folded square of paper. "Read this. If you still wish me gone afterward, I will not trouble you again." He bowed, turned on his heel, and walked away, leaving her standing in the lavender-scented air with her heart cracking open inside her chest. Inside the cottage, she unfolded the letter. His handwriting was strong and clean, the ink a dark slash against the cream paper. "Helena, I have no right to ask for your understanding, and less right to ask for your forgiveness. But I will ask for one thing only. Do not judge me by the cage I was born into. Judge me by what I do now. The tin discovery is real, but its value is uncertain. I leave tomorrow for London to confront my obligations. If I can find a way to break this engagement without destroying the livelihoods of 300 families, I will take it. And if I can return to you as a free man, I will do so on my knees. Until that day, believe that the man you met on the road, the man who saw you in the rain and felt the world shift under his feet, was not a duke. He was only a man, and he was entirely, irrevocably yours." "Ashworth." She read it 3 times. Then she pressed the paper to her lips, closed her eyes, and let the tears come. Outside, the workmen's hammers rang against the new timber of the repaired road, a road that had been broken and was being made whole again. She wondered, with a desperate, flickering hope, if a man might be remade the same way. The ball at Ashworth House was the event of the season, and Helena had never felt less like celebrating. The invitation had arrived a week after the Duke's departure for London, written in a feminine hand she did not recognize and sealed with the Ashworth crest. Lady Marguerite Selby requested the pleasure of Miss Helena Wren's company at a grand reception to mark the formal announcement of her betrothal to His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth. It was, Helena understood with cold clarity, a summons dressed as a courtesy. Lady Marguerite wished to inspect the rural curiosity who had occupied her fiancé's attention. Helena might have refused. She almost did. But pride was a stubborn flame, and she would not give the woman the satisfaction of thinking her intimidated. She borrowed a gown from Squire Trevanian's daughter, a deep forest green silk that made her dark hair and pale skin luminous, and endured the long carriage journey to the ducal seat with her spine straight and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ashworth House was a masterpiece of Palladian architecture, its columns and porticos glowing honey gold in the light of 1,000 candles. The great hall roared with music and conversation as Helena was announced. She saw the Duke at once, standing near the grand staircase with Lady Marguerite at his side, a slim, ice-blonde woman in a gown of silver tissue, her smile as sharp as cut glass. When her gaze found Helena, something flickered in those pale eyes. Recognition. Assessment. A predator's cool, unhurried intent. The Duke's expression was harder to read. He looked thinner than he had in Porthelot, the planes of his face more angular, shadows pooled beneath his gray eyes. When he saw her, his composure slipped for the barest instant, a tightening of his jaw, a flex of his fingers at his side. Then Lady Marguerite spoke, and he turned back to her with the mechanical precision of a soldier obeying orders. Helena navigated the crush of guests with a glass of ratafia she did not drink. She danced once with a kindly young baronet who asked gentle questions about Cornwall, and she smiled until her face ached. She was, she realized, performing a role as surely as the Duke was, the role of the unbothered country miss, unconcerned by the fact that her heart was being slowly crushed under the weight of an hour. The announcement came halfway through the evening. Lady Marguerite tapped her glass, and the room fell silent. "Dear friends," she said, her voice carrying to every corner, "His Grace and I are delighted to share our happy news with you this evening. Our union will unite two great families and secure the future of this magnificent estate. We ask you to raise your glasses and join us in a toast." Helena raised her glass. She did not drink. And then Lady Marguerite's eyes found her again, and a small, cruel smile curved her lips. "I understand we have a guest this evening who has recently become acquainted with His Grace under the most unusual circumstances. Miss Helena Wren of Porthelot. Miss Wren, we are so grateful to you for your brave intervention on the cliff road. I wonder, would you care to say a few words? A toast, perhaps, from the woman who saved my dear Duke's life." The room swiveled toward Helena like a tide. She felt the heat of 100 stares, the weight of expectation and curiosity and dawning scandal. This was a trap, elegantly sprung. If she refused, she would look churlish and ungrateful. If she spoke, every word would be dissected for evidence of the attachment that Lady Marguerite clearly suspected. Helena set down her glass. She walked forward, her head high, and she met Lady Marguerite's triumphant gaze with a calm she did not feel. "I thank you for the honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I did only what any decent person would do. The road was broken, and I wished to prevent a tragedy. I make no claim upon His Grace's gratitude, and I require no recognition. I wish the happy couple every blessing. That is all." She curtsied, deeply and correctly, and before anyone could respond, she turned and walked toward the terrace doors. The silence behind her was absolute. Then the whispers began, rising like a swarm of bees. The terrace was cold, lit only by the moon. Helena gripped the stone balustrade and drew ragged breaths, fighting the nausea that clawed at her stomach. She had survived. She had not humiliated herself, but she could not stay here a moment longer. "Helena." His voice, she did not turn. "You should not have come," he said, striding up beside her, his coat discarded, his cravat loosened as though he had torn at it. "Marguerite invited you to wound you. I did not know until it was too late." "It does not matter." She kept her eyes fixed on the dark expanse of the parkland. "You will marry her. The tin discovery, I assume it was not enough." He was silent. Then, "The seam is promising, but it will not yield for a year or more. The trustees will not wait, and Marguerite's father has threatened legal action if I delay further. The scandal of a broken engagement would give them grounds to challenge the entail. I am trapped." "Then you are trapped." She turned to face him, and the moonlight fell across her face, tracing the gleam of unshed tears. "But I am not. I will not be your mistress. I will not be the woman you visit in a cottage while your wife holds court in this house. I deserve more than that." "You deserve everything," he said, his voice breaking on the word. "And I have nothing to offer you except a ruined dukedom and a heart that has not been whole since the moment I met you." She reached up and very gently touched his cheek. His skin was warm, rough with the day's stubble. He closed his eyes as though the contact were painful. "Then we are at an impasse," she whispered. "Goodbye, Your Grace." She left him standing alone on the terrace, the moon his only witness, and she did not look back. The scandal erupted within a week. Lady Marguerite, it transpired, had not been content with a single public humiliation. She had paid a London gossip columnist to print a thinly veiled account of the Duke of Ashworth's indiscreet attachment to a penniless clergyman's daughter in Cornwall. The article did not name Helena directly, but it described the Cliff Road incident in sufficient detail that anyone in the county could identify her. The consequences were swift and brutal. Squire Trevanion's wife called upon Aunt Cordelia to express, with icy politeness, that continued association with the Wren household might prove difficult for a family with unmarried daughters. The baker's wife, once so eager for gossip, now served Helena with tight-lipped silence. Even old Mr. Trevithick, when she passed him on the lane, looked at the ground rather than meet her eyes. Helena endured it with the stoicism she had learned in the long months after her father's death. She tended her garden, read to her aunt, and wrote letters of application to employment agencies in Bath and York. She would become a governess, a companion, anything that would take her away from the county that had become a gilded cage. A week before she was due to depart, a letter arrived bearing the Ashworth seal. She opened it with trembling fingers, expecting a final farewell. Instead, she found a legal document, a deed of gift, transferring ownership of a small cottage on the edge of the Ashworth estate to one Miss Helena Wren, along with an annuity of £200 per annum in recognition of services rendered in the preservation of human life. The accompanying note, written in a clerk's careful hand, made no mention of love or regret. It was formal, bloodless, correct. A payment, a dismissal. The Duke was buying her silence and her absence with a comfortable cage of her own. Helena stared at the document for a long time. Then she took up her pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote a single sentence on a clean sheet of paper. "I am not a debt to be discharged." She sealed the deed and the note together and sent them back to Ashworth House. That afternoon, she packed her meager belongings into a single trunk, kissed her bewildered aunt goodbye, and boarded the mail coach for Bath. The coaching inn at Exeter was crowded and noisy when the Duke of Ashworth strode through its doors 3 days later. He had ridden hard from London, having received Helena's return deed and the news from a frantic servant that she had left Porthelloe. His coat was travel-stained, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held a wildness that made the innkeeper step hastily aside. "A young woman traveling alone, dark hair, gray cloak, booked passage through here yesterday," he demanded. "Where was she bound?" "Bath, Your Grace, but the coach left at dawn. You'll not catch it now." The Duke swore under his breath and turned toward the stables. He would ride through the night if he had to. He found her at a small posting-house on the outskirts of Bath the following evening, sitting alone in the parlor with a cup of tea cooling before her. She looked up when the door opened, and the cup rattled in its saucer. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I have spent 3 days asking every ostler and innkeeper between Porthelloe and Bath if they had seen a woman with a storm in her hair," he said, crossing the room in 3 strides. "You would be surprised how many remembered you." He dropped into the chair opposite her, his hands gripping the arms as though to prevent himself from reaching for her. "I received your note. The deed was not meant as an insult. I was trying to ensure your security while I fought for my freedom." "And have you won it?" she asked, her tone brittle. The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a folded newspaper, its ink still fresh. The headline read, SELBY Banking House in Crisis. Lord SELBY flees two continent amid fraud ALLEGATIONS. It broke the day after the ball, he said. Marguerite's fortune was a fiction. Her father has been running a fraudulent scheme for a decade. The engagement is void. No contract can bind a man to a house built on theft. My solicitors confirmed it yesterday. I am free, Helena, free to marry where I choose. She stared at the newspaper, her mind reeling. And the tin, the estate. The seam is richer than we dared hope. The first shipments will pay off my father's debts within the year. I do not need a fortune. I need only you. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the inn's other guests. Then Helena rose, walked around the table and took his face in her hands. You should have told me you were sending that deed, she said, her voice thick. You should have written to me yourself, not through a clerk. You should have trusted me with the truth of your fight. I should have done 1,000 things differently, he said, his hands coming up to cover hers. But I am here now, on my knees as I promised. Will you have me, Helena? Not the Duke. Just the man who nearly drove his carriage off a cliff and was saved by a woman who refused to be invisible. She kissed him then in the shabby parlor of a Bath-posting house, with no witnesses but the firelight and the moon. And when they finally drew apart, she was laughing and crying, and his gray eyes shone with a light she had never seen there before. Yes, she said. Yes, you impossible, infuriating man. Yes. They were married 6 weeks later in the small stone church at Porthelloe, the same church where Helena's father had preached for 30 years. The banns had been read to a congregation that could barely fit into the pews, and the churchyard overflowed with villagers who had come to witness the impossible. A local girl, a vicar's daughter with no fortune and no connections, becoming the Duchess of Ashworth. Helena walked down the aisle on the arm of her brother, Captain James Wren, who had returned from India 2 weeks before the wedding, thin and sun-browned and profoundly relieved. His silence, it turned out, had been the result of a fever that had left him unconscious in a military hospital for 6 months. The Duke had paid for his passage home as a wedding gift, and the sight of him standing beside her had been worth more than any jewel. The ceremony was simple. The Duke stood at the altar in a coat of deep blue, his shoulders back, his eyes never leaving Helena's face. She wore a gown of ivory silk, sewn by a Bath modiste who had once made dresses for the highest society, and she carried a posy of lavender and rosemary from her own garden. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, a great cheer went up from the assembled crowd, and the bells of Porthelloe rang out across the sea. The wedding breakfast was held on the newly restored cliff road itself. Long tables had been set up on the stretch that had once crumbled into the ravine, now reinforced with stone and timber, and protected by a low, elegant balustrade. The villagers feasted on roast lamb and syllabub, and the Duke himself walked among them, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with a warmth that surprised those who had known the family only from a distance. As the afternoon light began to soften into gold, the Duke drew his bride away from the crowd and led her to the edge of the road, where the cliff fell away to the churning sea below. I have something to show you, he said. Set into the new stone of the balustrade was a small bronze plaque. Helena bent to read the inscription. On this spot, on the 14th of September, 1834, Miss Helena Wren stood in the path of a carriage and prevented a great tragedy. Her courage brought a duke to his senses and a road back from ruin. Let this stone stand as a testament to the truth that the smallest acts of bravery may alter the course of history. She straightened, her eyes brimming. You did this for me. I did it for everyone who will ever travel this road, he said, taking her hands in his. But yes, it is for you. Everything I build from this day forward will be for you, Helena. The tin mines, the repaired tenancies, the new school I intend to open in the village, all of it. You reminded me that a dukedom is not a cage. It is a responsibility. and I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside you." She looked up at him, this man who had arrived in her life cloaked in rain and secrets, and who now stood before her with his heart laid bare. The wind lifted her veil and tangled it with his cravat, and they laughed, and he bent to kiss her, and the salt breeze carried the sound of wedding bells and the endless murmur of the sea. Later, as the stars began to prick the darkening sky and the last of the guests departed, the Duke and his new Duchess walked slowly back along the cliff road toward the cottage where it had all begun. Aunt Cordelia had insisted on remaining there for the night, to give them privacy at the great house, but Helena had asked for this one walk first. They paused at the gate, just as they had done 100 years ago, when he was Mr. Ashe, and she was a woman who had stopped a stranger's carriage with nothing but her voice and her courage. "I have a confession," she said, her hand resting on the worn wood. "That night when I stood in the road, I was terrified. I nearly did not do it. I thought of my father, of how he always said that a life of faith meant acting even when you were afraid, and I closed my eyes and stepped forward." "And you saved me," he said. "And I saved myself," she replied, her voice soft but sure. "I had been half alive since my father died, going through the motions of a life I did not truly want. Stopping your carriage was the first thing I had done in a year that felt entirely my own. You were a duke in hiding, and I was a woman who had forgotten she had a voice. We both needed saving." He drew her into his arms, and the sea crashed below, steady as a heartbeat. "Then we saved each other, and we shall continue to do so every day for as long as we both shall live." They walked on, toward the great house that waited for them, its windows glowing with candlelight against the dark. Behind them the bronze plaque caught the last light of the dying sun, and the words gleamed faintly, a promise carved in stone. The road was whole, the storm had passed, and two people who had met in the fury of wind and water now stepped forward into a future they had built together, hand in hand, unafraid.